and hopefully before too long from Yemen as well. So we're going to have to do a slight change to running order because Cameron, who is presenting her work from Yemen, is not able to join us just yet. So I think we're going to start with Dr. Borden talking about knowledge infrastructure, a missing link in smart cities. And I wonder if we could sort of focus the discussion on the issues around the sort of the special nature of cities and urban infrastructure and how that influences engagement in the sort of political processes.
Right.
So, thank you. So sorry, just to remind everyone, we're suggesting sort of 3 minutes or so, just to sort of present some key points and some provocations, and then we can open it up for discussion. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Richard, and hi to everyone from John from England and Bobby, everyone. Okay. Just a quick. I think these papers allow me to thinking more on some things, and I think thanks for everyone also to push me on this paper. Very interestingly is as an experience that we got from especially Thailand. We found out many key points in this presentation. First thing first is smart city. In my experience, is very key question is it right direction or not? My answer is wow. It should be a next step of our society. Even though we like it or not, it's come to us already. But each society approaches in different way. In Thailand, I think a key message is smart city is not just a policy, and the thing that we done in Thailand, I think, very interesting. I mean that we try in different way, but we cannot integrate between top-down policy and the real smart city that we're looking forward to. So, but bottom line is the smart city is going to lead us into new economic platform. So angle from capitalism, we see smart city is a policy agenda in global scale. That is a one direction. And it's very differently from developed country and developing countries, and also other developed countries also. Another one is we see smart city, as we discussed before, as a part of the agenda that drive us into the better quality of life, better livable city. So these two indicators is linked together. But the thing that's from the lens of knowledge infrastructure, allow me to see that it's not just other things that they push together, but for lens of the knowledge infrastructure, I think smart city is allow us to see our society in different way. The first, the society is based on data, society based on information infrastructure, and now if we going to have a right smart city, that means our society is based on knowledge infrastructure. That this concept will encourage us to question back what our city are and what is the digital infrastructure or ICT help us as enabler to make sure that our knowledge infrastructure is the right thing to do or to see. If we approach it without this concept of knowledge infrastructure, I think that we're going to be a very wrong direction, especially if we not let different stakeholders discuss together, something like that. So bottom line is the smart city in different perspective. I think the missing links in the smart city is the knowledge infrastructure concept, rather than digital development concept, or rather than new economy concept. But the core of the smart city, if I were citizen in this city, I think we would like to looking forward the society that build knowledge infrastructure And in the future, we might discuss more about the rather than knowledge infrastructure, discuss more about the intelligent infrastructure that help us as the new generation Homo deus or the other type of the mankind that based on new infrastructure. Because as new generation, we know that we are not the same. Infrastructure build us, influence us, and also be influence the infrastructure too. So these two things interact to each other between the mankind and infrastructure that we build.
Thanks, Dr. Boone. I think that's a really good point to sort of pause. There's a lot in your paper that we could discuss, but I think this tension between, are we being shaped by the smart city agenda and what is driving it, and whereas are we able to sort of use this new impetus for data and information as a way of reshaping the cities and reshaping our sort of political structures and relations as well. Do we have any, I think maybe we could have sort of quick questions now and then maybe go through all of the presentations and try and have some sort of more open discussion that can also draw on the first sessions as well. Are there any sort of quick questions for Boone? John's smiling with a quick question, which
well, I've got questions, but they're not quick.
Are they the kind of questions
we'll leave it
open to the panel as a whole? So I think there's quite a nice thread that runs through these presentations. If that's okay with everyone, then I think we should move forward and then and open things up. Cameron's just joined late, so I think it's only fair to let her sort of catch her breath a bit, and maybe Dr. Mem, would you like to go next?
Yep. Right, thank you. Okay, so my presentation focuses on understanding climate vulnerabilities as well as understanding urbanization. So we selected cities in the upper northeast region of Thailand. These are secondary cities that are connected from on the main road from Bangkok. But with there are large-scale infrastructure projects that will link all these cities to industrialized areas in Thailand. So these are special economic zones, linking with the industrial areas to the cities, but also to China. So these are not really traditional cities anymore, the way, with urbanization process and patterns. So to understand climate vulnerabilities, we started off just try to understand the urbanization process and patterns. And so I actually try to use the concept of planetary urbanization to try to reflect on this new forms of urbanization. And but because these cities are not really traditional anymore, they don't have fixed boundaries. The boundaries between rural and urban are quite blurred. And so to assess climate vulnerabilities, we need to understand these new forms of urban governance. And so we need new approaches to be able to unpack this urban governance, but also the interactions between political and institutional actors, how they contribute to climate vulnerabilities of cities and also of urban communities. So that's just my quick capture of my presentation, just to keep up with the time.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks very much. And again, I think the case, your paper speaks very nicely to the sort of complexity of scale, defining cities and boundaries, quite similar to some of the points that William Rees made in the plenary session and that Ramurevi made, but also how these city-urban vulnerabilities are shaped by certain kinds of interests and processes. Again, are there any sort of, I think, we're going to have a nice conversation when we hear from everybody, but are there any quick questions for Bakamas? I hope I'm not stifling debate by trying to run it this way. So, Cameron, would you like to go next?
Yes, sure. Can you hear me? Is there interference in the sound? Just let me know. Am I coming?
No, it's okay.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, so I am presenting work in progress on Marib, Yemen, and it was a bit of a challenge for me because I was trying to distill a very pro forma sort of positivist UN habitat urban profile, which is a fairly standard offering I'm sure you're all familiar with. And through the work and the profile, it's one of the largest cities now in Yemen, and it's become a host city. Over 75% are internally displaced people in the population. And like Pontip was saying, this city doesn't follow any traditional, it's in between formal and informal, and it's really in still being defined in many ways, but the issue which kind of sparked this personal research, which I hope to get feedback on and continue in some way that's more constructive maybe than my initial paper, it was the master plan that was presented in 2019. And it really spelled an environmental disaster as well as a social disaster for the tribal confederations. And these, we surveyed over 1,500 people. They have no connection to the master plan. They're not even aware that it exists. So then the questions raised were, how can participatory research engage the citizenry in a meaningful way going forward, and what theoretical framework is really best at this time in Yemen when so many of the rights have been denied to the people in this population in Maghreb as well as in the broader country. So anyway, that's a quick recap, basically questioning how do we move forward and discard the existing frameworks we have, the SDG goals surrounding urban formations for SDG 11 are really not helpful at this stage for a city like Marib. I guess that's my quick recap. And I look forward to any guidance and comments, criticisms, etc. So I'm kind of in between, as you could say, an institutional approach and a more critical, ecological, radical revisioning of what is possible. If that makes sense. Okay.
Great, thanks very much. I think the questions that you pose speak very neatly to the kinds of things that we've been struggling with in our program as well. So I'm sure colleagues from Thailand and Nepal will have something to say, particularly about what you talk about.
Welcome it all.
What is it? The nice line, the magical thinking of the master plan, that resonates very well. So again, maybe actually this would be, because I think our final presentation is wraps things up as well. So maybe this would be a time to open up questions to our first three papers. There's quite a lot of common threads across the three. And then with the final paper, we'll try and sort of pull things together as well. Anybody, anything for anyone? Dr. Num, are you?
I think perhaps we can do like all paper, like 4 papers, and then open up for conversation as a whole. Because looking at Cameron's study, I think I find some of the similarity. Yeah. On my study as well. So perhaps I can kick off my brief of the study, which will echo both Cameron's and I also would like to bring some of the note from William Reed this morning that he mentions about issues around electric vehicles and its life cycle. So one of our studies also looking at the supply chain of electric vehicles and the batteries and the plan to industrialize these green innovation, which will centers around land use planning, which has some contestation with local livelihoods and the local communities who hold particular local expertise. So I think it might echo some of Cameron's points about the plan that have an impact towards perhaps the indigenous people. But this paper, we would like to build something upon that, because in the competing narratives between these juxtaposing to forces, we found concepts such as innovation, competitiveness, middle income country as part of a rationale to support the prioritized approach at the national and local level. But in this paper, we would like to look at the knowledge infrastructure that sustain and underpin these concepts at the global level. And by knowledge infrastructure in this study, we highlight 3 dimensions of this. First is the knowledge itself. Second is the alliance who produce such knowledge. And third is the technologies and techniques in the production of data that support those knowledge. And we draw materials from reports at the global level in relation to these concepts. And here are some highlights that perhaps I would like to open up for discussion. First, and in the technology dimension, we found the technologies in metrics, indices, and indicators are used to measure and rank different countries in relation to these concepts, such as global competitiveness ranking, global innovation ranking. And these techniques, by using knowledge infrastructure, we can unpack sort of a complex network of organizations and people who support and use these techniques. And then we can compare their power relation of these leading international organizations with other groups of people who may also produce knowledge that have less power relationship, such as the knowledge that produced by local civil society or the community itself. But the critical point that I would like to point out is the output of the knowledge in this term. It's a knowledge that highlights the vertical differences or the ordinal differences among different countries in terms of ranking. So I think it kind of opened up some question, such as whether such ranking techniques can be considered technology that has consequences on subordination or suppression, whether they influence the construct of subjectivity of each nation, and if so, whether such constructed subjectivities affect the way each state develop its policies, and if so, whether if such priority put into these concepts may lead to the misrecognitions of particular form of knowledge, such as local expertise or indigenous knowledge or not. And what we would like to contribute is to demonstrate that by doing this kind of analysis, it might open up channels for changes. For example, we might looking at options that we might change the technique itself. We might change the indices, indicators that may more inclusive, may include more form of knowledge. Or we might need to produce a new form of knowledge, a new ranking system that competing or shaking the power relation of existing form of the knowledge produced right now. And doing so, we might also need a new form of alliance to do so. So this is kind of a highlights that we would like to contribute to the conversation, and really love to hear comments and perhaps to link with other studies in our panel as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Norman. I think that really does tie things together very neatly, all the way back to where we started in this morning as well. I'm not going to try and summarize because Norman's summarized it all very neatly himself. Are there any? So let's open it up for a sort of a free discussion, really, sort of maybe some questions specifically to Num, or just some thoughts and reflections drawing on what we've heard in this session and the earlier sessions. I'm being very well behaved by not jumping in myself. And again, I would invite any of the speakers from the earlier sessions who are still here, who might want to contribute. Please feel free.
Perhaps, if I may, a jump of on some of the reflection that Richard gave in the later section in terms of the roles of different forms of technologies and the way the data produced, and how it shaped the role of interaction between different power relations and stakeholders. I think when you compare Schuman's studies and Ponte and my study, I think it kind of display different forms of technologies. Like in Schuman, it's such a technologies that perhaps kind of advocate by state, but Ponte is a technology in terms, it's some sort of similar technology in terms of sensors or thing, but organized by different actors. Like visuals is more kind of disconnected with the state, but allow space for the broader public. But the technologies in my study, it's not very technical, but it's more in terms of metrics and measurements. But it kind of differentiate and capture different aspect of information. But in the end, it has a political implication that embedded in these techniques used to produce data for the knowledge. That's one of my observations, and perhaps other may like to comment on that.
Thanks very much. I mean, I think that's a really key point across the conversation. We're talking about very different kinds of technologies, different kinds and scales of technology and knowledge, and of infrastructure as well. So I think we have to be sort of aware of that as we try and refine the way we engage. Bobby, you've got your hand raised, please.
Thanks, Richard. Just a really quick reflection in regards to each of the papers. In terms of the first three, I thought what was quite interesting was in this discussion of kind of technology, there seemed to be a kind of implicit description or implicit kind of discussion of underlying kind of, you could say, urban imaginaries or visions. Richard, you mentioned myths earlier, right? for how the urban is understood. So in the kind of the first paper, Cameron's paper, there's this kind of juxtaposition between understandings of the urban past in Yemen, and to what extent this can be perhaps included or acknowledged or represented in contemporary urban planning processes. In the second paper, Poon, you talk about kind of smart cities, and what I was quite curious to learn more, but I think it's kind of there implicitly in the paper, is this kind of behind this idea of the smart city, there's perhaps a particular vision of what a city should be normatively, right? So when you talk about there's the kind of the different stages, right, in the development of a smart city, and implied by that is a particular understanding of what a city should be, what type of subjects are best, aligned to make that city work, right? What type of knowledge is required for that, and then in the third paper, Pakamas, I think what you're doing in that paper is really interesting, because you're trying to reimagine or suggest a reimagining of the urban by breaking down these different dichotomies of how the city is traditionally understood and how urban, peri-urban, and so forth are perhaps can be reimagined, and how vulnerability can be rethought if we think of this kind of urbanization as a planetary process. So I thought those three papers kind of complemented each other. And lastly, I won't blabber on too much more, but with the what knowledge counts point, I think you raise an interesting question around how these kind of imaginaries that perhaps are antithetical to how science is traditionally understood can be brought into the picture by processes of categorization, by taking on board kind of technical practices and so forth, and that there's this kind of tension involved, right, in kind of reimagining what's entailed by scientific and technical practice. Anyway, that's some just kind of brief reflections. I found all the papers really excellent.
Yes, John, and as John said, perhaps I would just encourage some of our other presenters, including we still have Katrine and Xu Wen from the earlier sessions. I think whose papers also speak to these issues very neatly as well. So John, please.
I was going to say, shall I kind of loiter in the background? I don't want to take up time for if the other presenters have got thoughts or reflections in response to those comments from Bobby, which I thought were really helpful. Then, given our limited time, do you want to feel free to dive in?
Well, feel free to interrupt, John, if you feel if appropriate. But John, why don't you kick things off?
Yeah, so I was just going to say that I was going to kind of pick up on the knowledge infrastructure point a little bit, and this question of both technology, this kind of interplay between technology and expertise, and thinking about technology not just in terms of kind of devices, but in terms of the data that gets produced and the expertise that's required to wield both those devices and to understand that data. I thought that the discussion about smart cities was really helpful here. That if we think about, here I saw knowledge infrastructure as offering insights that are, on the one hand, analytical, that helps us understand kind of representation, inclusion, recognition, legitimacy within the smart city. So who gets represented within that data, and in terms of how that data is analysed. So here we're emphasising or acknowledging the role of data and analytics in how meaning is made in these new cities, which I think is critical for kind of understanding the kind of next wave of urbanizations. But also what's useful is that I think that this can be a call for action, or it can enable us to think about how we affect change at the very least. Because understanding these aspects of knowledge infrastructure allows us to think about how data and the alliances that wield data might be able to enable certain issues to gain political salience in a particular context. So can we create political salience through citizen use of data and emphasis on data transparency in the way in which we heard happened in Chiang Mai from in the last session, And can we identify what these critical issues are, what the critical forms of data are, what forms of expertise may be required, what new alliances might be effective, by having this more nuanced understanding of the status quo that comes from the knowledge infrastructure analytic. I think we're starting to see how that might operate in lots of different contexts. But there's a hand up, so I'm going to shut up.
Yeah. No, I think that's really helpful, John. I'll just before I invite Katrine to sort of join in, I think something else that Bongtip and the other presenters spoke to really is it's not just the sort of data and the information, it's the and the evidence, it's the arguments that are constructed around that. And I think that relates to the point you're making about entry points. So I think, in Chiang Mai, I think the framing of a breadth council and trying not to be confrontational was really significant as well.
Unpacking political saliency, which was left unexplored in that, wasn't it? Yes.
Right.
That's
so
really
Katrine, sorry, please.
No, actually, my point connects to that very well, because I just want to say, I think what's also interesting from all the different presentations is of course, the question of the technology and kind of the kind of knowledge that gets produced in different ways and how it's used. But I think another crucial issue is linked to governance and the question of power and the question of how do we, even if we acknowledge different kinds of knowledge, but then how do we act upon this? How do we transfer that into something that is transformative and that actually can achieve change? And I think there, I think that would be a really interesting conversation to have as well, to not just think about the kind of participatory spaces where knowledge gets produced and negotiated, but then actually what happens with it and and I think that's also something that came out from the presentation today. It's very context specific. So how do we take these different forms from different places with different governance systems in place and bring that together to take forward?
Yes, thanks very much. I think you're right. It's a point that does speak to our earlier presenters and Anusha's case, and also Xu Wen's case, and the role of these sort of intermediary brokers. Can I? Xu Wen, you've got your camera on. Oh, please.
Oh yeah, I just want to share some thoughts and so in my case and also in the case in Thailand and other cases that we all have observed that the citizens or the people, they are to some degree they are empowered by like data or like open data or this kind of new evidence-based technology. But this kind of phenomenon, I think I also read through like in earlier studies in like participatory GIS, some were quite early, like 10 or even longer time ago. But here I just thought of something that I haven't, I think I still need to like further explore in my case, but I also would like to ask in other cases that whether we have the observation that to what degree those citizens, they are kind of empowered by technology in the negotiation with the government or the other actors. I mean, sometimes the technology, they can be only just like tokenism, right? And to some degrees, like the government, they see, oh yeah, like you know something. So we don't see you as like kind of ordinary people, and you will have some expertise. So we would like to talk with you. But when something that happened to a certain degree and to further steps, it might touch upon a certain interest group or some more complicated situation, and then that might stop this kind of empowerment. So I was just curious at whether these kind of things have been observed in some other cases.
Yeah, thanks very much. Great points, great questions. So I think Bobby first, and then John.
Just to that last point, Xu Wen, it's quite interesting that you raise that point, because it kind of speaks to the limits of how we understand participation or how participation might be understood. And I think, that, would compel us to take different kind of conceptual models for understanding participation on board. And this is one of the problems that BJ and our paper is trying to kind of explore by looking at different ways in which recognition might be understood around different infrastructure. So by taking a governmental or a governmentality lens, we can see a certain aspect to recognition. But there's limits to that as well, because there's a tendency, for example, to reproduce status categories and to reproduce kind of knowledge hierarchies that you can trace to colonial histories, for example. Similarly, there's limits to a communicative, deliberative democracy approach to recognition. So our approach to that problem is to try to tackle it from different angles and to try to open up recognition as kind of a holistic process.
Thanks, Bobby. Cameron, you also have your hand up. Sorry, I think you're on mute.
Excuse me? Yes. Oh, I just wanted to echo what everyone has said thus far about how context-specific knowledge must be, and then addressing power relations, especially when technology is involved, just raises further questions of the techno-feudalist concerns of how easily participation can be kind of tokenized, as I think Xuan was saying, without really getting to the nuts and bolts of genuine subjectivity or expression of rights and desires, which I think Bobby's paper also touched on in really important ways, or ways that I never thought of before. But I feel like I have a lot I wanted to say also with regard to both studies from Thailand, but if we can be in touch after, that would be great, because I feel like with the other discussants, there is much more that's come out now that we're all talking that I'd like to follow up on, but I don't think we have time now. But there's a paper too that this all reminded me of it's called On Belonging and Becoming in the Settler Colonial City, Co-Produced Futurities, Placemaking and Urban Planning in the US. So it's trying to get to the question of alternative indigenous rights and how they can reshape frameworks of knowledge production and also measurement of citizen participation. So I'll put it in the chat comments. It seems it might be relevant to some of your work ongoing. That's all.
Great, thanks very much. I think, yes, thanks for the paper recommendation. And certainly, as much as I think we should, as we wrap up, think about how we keep in touch and what we might do as a sort of a loose grouping. And I think, sorry, Lum's got a comment. Yes, and technology is part of underlying problems versus solutions. I think, yes, is an important consideration, but also how much these agendas are being shaped by sort of technologies or narratives of technology and expertise. I think it seems to cut across all the case studies we've heard. And I mean, it's most apparent, I guess, in the smart city agenda, which is hugely influential. We know that our government, in its infinite wisdom, is very keen to support this as it expands British business interests around the world. But I think, yes, I'll give the floor to John, who might want to wrap up, but I would certainly vote for us keeping in touch and exploring how we can continue the conversation and create the opportunity to learn from these very different context-specific experiences. Thanks very much. So, John, over to you.
Well, thanks, Richard. I'm not sure there's much more to be said apart from to thank all of the presenters, and I think Bobby in particular, who's handled the first two sessions extremely effectively. I'd echo Richard's call for staying in touch, and there's clearly a shared set of interests here. I'm personally fascinated by seeing if we can more properly identify these sorts of prior questions that need to come before we engage them in participation. There's a lot of faith placed in participation, but what I'm seeing from this discussion of context specificity and the role of expertise and technology and data is that we need to understand the context in which we're intervening, and much better before we jump in with these participatory processes. So there's an agenda there around setting the kind of common or generic questions that might help us move forward with being more effective and equitable in the use of the processes that we anticipate are going to drive towards effectiveness and effective and equitable outcomes. I've nothing further other than to thank everybody again, and to thank the volunteers who've made all of this possible. And I look forward to staying in touch with everybody. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah.
Thank you.
Keep in touch. Well, we'll email everybody.
Take care. Thank you.